I'm just going to quickly introduce the moderator of the panel, Declan McCullagh, who has been with CNET for 11 years and is just taking a bit of a sabbatical to develop out an interesting project to aggregate news or news tweeting and other social media. And if you're interested in that, the web address is http //recent recent.io. So go and see what Declan's doing in his sabbatical. I will now pass it over to Declan, who will introduce the panel, and I hope you have a fun event. Speak to you later. Thanks.
Well, thanks for the gracious introduction. It's a pleasure to be here because we don't have enough of these discussions comparing the left and the right coast, especially out here in Silicon Valley. I spent 10 years living and working in Washington, D.C., and then moved out here where I work when I'm not on sabbatical at CNET, which is part of CBS and over at 235 2nd Street. So I at least have a bit of a feel for this left coast to right coast divide. So the topics we're going to talk about today, if we actually get around to all of these, are things like how do the different coasts think about the future? Are these visions of how to promote and adapt to technological change really fundamentally compatible? And can technology trump politics? And so with me today are folks I will try to pigeonhole just for your entertainment. We have...
Do we get to pigeonhole back?
Well, no, actually, I get to set the rules here. I'm the moderator. No. We have Berin, who, just for that, will go first. Berin is the president of TechFreedom. He is the nominal libertarian on the panel. And he may not be a true libertarian because he doesn't actually want to abolish enough federal agencies, but he does at least want to reform them. So I think that probably qualifies. He has written things that are glowing about the Federal Trade Commission and its potential to do good in this space, which probably pits him against the Tea Party types. We also have Larry. Who is hopefully not making that horrible noise. Larry's an author. He lives in the East Bay. He is local. Berin is in D.C. Larry claims not to be a libertarian, though he has posted glowing book reviews on his website written by libertarians and saying this is a libertarian-ish treatise. So I'm not really sure about your non-libertarian credentials. You might be a closet one. But I think Larry is probably more a fact-based analytical. His favorite thing to do is to write an article in the Harvard Business Review and then turn it into a book, which is what he's doing right now, in fact. When is the book coming out?
January 7th.
And the name of it?
Big Bang Disruption.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we have Mike, who wants to be called a progressive, but I'll call him a lefty. He is based here in San Francisco. Lives out in the Sunset, and is the co-founder and chief political strategist for Engine Advocacy, which has been very active in the last few years and trying to have a left coast input on some of the things that Washington, D.C. does that are so annoying. Maybe Mike, I'll start with you. I mean, we had, this is approaching 2 years ago, the Szoka debate. This struck me as a pretty good example of how these the left versus right coast, the visions are in conflict. We have, that really might be me. Sorry about that, folks. You had SOPA and the Senate companion legislation were co-sponsored in the Senate by a Democrat, Patrick Leahy, and in the House by a Republican, Lamar Smith. They're pretty much identical bills. And they were also defeated by this cross-partisan coalition. And have we learned anything from this? This is approaching 2 years ago.
I think we have learned a lot, and thank you again. It's wonderful to be here, and thanks to everybody for putting this together, and Declan for moderating. I think we have learned a lot. I think one of the things, and I get asked about this in my travels around the country trying to support entrepreneurial communities, is, Silicon Valley, entrepreneurs in general, are they left of center, are they right of center? And what I've sort of come to in working with this community around the country for the last few years is it may be nonpartisan, it may be bipartisan, it may be post-partisan, it may be all of that, it may be none of that. And that, I think, is the learning curve that we're on post-SOPA. There were a lot of different people from a lot of different constituencies both political and otherwise, that got up in arms and made a big difference on SOPA. And that, I think, was indicative of the power that this community, rooted in technology, can have when they set their mind to it and when there's enough sort of push from that community to take action. What we've seen in the interim is that there's no recreating that example as well. Each of these is going to be different, but I think in dealing with politicians, especially in Washington, that the threat is there makes us a powerful constituency all the same. It's the old adage about Bill Russell didn't like to throw elbows under the basket, but he did it once on national television and no one really bothered him ever again. So that's sort of where we're starting to build and starting to hope. But as to where that lies, you're looking at generational change. I mean, a lot of the demographics of the entrepreneurial movement, can in places, especially outside Silicon Valley, reflect the country as a whole. But here in the Valley, you've got a usually fairly young, at least socially progressive community. How that then reflects in politics, especially where a lot of times we talk about regulation and in some cases the lack thereof, or smarter regulation, or however you want to put it, that leads to this odd partisan, the strange bedfellows of politics, where I can have a meeting with Mark Warner and I can have a meeting with Darrell Issa, and the topic and the outcomes can be the same, even though those are two people that are diametrically opposed, seemingly, on the political spectrum. So, in terms of what we learned, I think we're still learning. I think we're still trying to figure it out.
Let me interrupt you there. Are these incompatibilities social issues or fiscal issues? I wrote an article in 2008 for CNET talking about Tim Draper, one of the Silicon Valley's leading venture capitalists. I mean, he in 2000 and 1999 he was dubbed George W. that is Bush's point man in Silicon Valley. He was out there, hosted 3 fundraisers before Bush even got the nomination, over a year before the election, and then in 2008, he swapped and was starting to talk up the wonders. It's good to have a fresh face, he told us for the article, about Obama. So is it the Republicans aren't going to have a chance until they start embracing or move more left on social issues? Is that it?
No, I don't think that's it at all. I think what you're looking at is a constituency that, while it is savvy, is not necessarily mature, especially in a DC sense. Silicon Valley as an idea has only been around 50 years, right? I mean, or 60, I suppose, since the war. And that is not a lot of time in political terms. It is actually in political terms simultaneously, overnight and not along, and what have you. But the point is, people are still learning, and as new people come into this valley and new people create new products and gain prominence and gain a foothold, they're all sort of learning on the fly. They just know they got a bunch of money and people are going to try to separate them from it in a political context. So I guess they better get, savvy and think about this stuff. But there is no construct that they go into in the same way that a manufacturing company executive who built a new manufacturing company might, because there are established lines between the unions and the corporations or what have you. Those lines have never been well established in Silicon Valley. And we are, again, still on that learning curve of how we're going to get to a situation where there is a little bit more of a consciousness amongst all of us.
Let me stop you there and ask Berin what he thinks about, you mentioned learning curve. T.J. Rogers is the CEO of Cypress Semiconductor. He's much more of a Silicon Valley than a San Francisco type. He told me in an interview I did with him a few years ago, and is also an ardent libertarian who said that he'll vote Republican if they put up non-nuts for the nomination. You talked about political pygmies.
That happens.
Well, that was I was interviewing during an election year. It was unclear what was going to happen that year. But he talks about political pygmies in Sacramento. He's very outspoken, but he wrote something for the Cato Institute over 10 years ago, saying it was the opposite of this education curve. It was kind of like the diseducation or uneducation curve, saying let's not we Silicon Valley folks, let's not tell DC what we're doing, because then it'll help them regulate us and control us better. Berin is as a libertarian light in D.C. Is this something that you would agree with?
Well, I think there's a mixture of truth and naivete in what he was saying. So I think if to put this in context,
he's the CEO of a $1 billion plus company, and the co-founders, and naivete.
And that doesn't mean that one can't be a little naive about politics. And certainly 15 years ago, I think everybody here was. And I think what Mike is saying is that people are, to some extent, starting to grow out of that. And the question is, one of the questions I think is fascinating for this event today and for everybody here is what that means. So when I say grow out of that, I don't mean that I want everyone here to play the game in the way that everybody else does. And so in that sense, I certainly agree with TJ. I think he was absolutely right that getting involved in politics does corrupt. It tends to make people think that they can solve their competitive problems in Washington if they can't win in the marketplace. It tends to make people think that DC can really help them, not just by getting out of the way, but in some positive sense can make the world better. But on the other hand, where I think not just TJ, but everybody in the 90s in the tech industry was a little naive about politics, is that what Eric Goldman, professor out here at Santa Clara Law School, he, I think very helpfully suggests that internet exceptionalism can really be thought of in three waves. And the first wave, 1996, Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace by John Perry Barlow, is really the height of that. It's the idea that technology will always win. Politics and the government are essentially irrelevant. Governments of the industrial world, you have no sovereignty where we gather. You can't really even affect us, so go away. That clearly proved not to be true. And the second wave of people who pushed back against that pointed out that, for example, in SOPA, the entire debate about SOPA really hinged on the government's ability to clamp down on certain mechanisms about payment, the interface between the internet and advertising, the things that actually support websites. Those are all points of control. And whether or not the government should, it's certainly true that they can clamp down on those. And so as a matter of refining your vision over time, even if you think that the internet is different, that technology is more powerful in the long term than politics, you have to grow up a little bit and understand that DC can still screw things up a lot. And so the vision of internet exceptionalism, I think, is really evolving towards something that is different in important ways. It's not the idea that the internet is immune to technology, that there's nothing that the government can really do to stop it. But rather, the thing that I think is today on issues like SOPA is increasingly uniting odd bedfellows coalitions, which is to say, whatever we think about social justice issues, the right level of taxation, Obamacare, we, people who are pro-technology, agree on a lot. And it really is because we think that, in some sense, the internet technology is different. We might be, if to speak for people who maybe come more from Mike's end of the spectrum, they might be less optimistic about the government's ability to get things right when it comes to technology, more optimistic about the ability of technological change, and I think this is the theme of Larry's work, to, in the long term, protect consumers, to tear down even the mightiest of corporate incumbents. In other words, people who think that government has an active role in many areas of life can still take a very different view in this area. And so to me, the real clash between DC and San Francisco as proxies for some larger clash of visions isn't really between left and right, and it isn't even really between the traditional basic underlying ways that people on those ends of the spectrum tend to think about the world and human nature. It really comes down to attitudes towards change and a willingness to either embrace the future and in all of its messiness and unplannability, and to be very skeptical about the ability of policymakers to plan it or steer it or improve on it. That's the spectrum that I would take.
But DC is always backward looking, right? I mean, right. How many politicians do you have who are looking ahead as much as some of the CEOs out here
So I think there are three archetypes that we should keep in mind. So what I'm arguing for is what Virginia Pestrel in 1998 called dynamism. And it's not warmed over libertarianism. It is something that is broader than libertarianism. It can include people on the left that are pro-technology and importantly are willing to let it play out and are skeptical about government's ability to get things right. That's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum, and it's not a monolith, there are people all the way along the range, is what she broadly described as the stasis mentality. And the important thing, and the thing that confuses people about these debates, is that there are two very different variants of that. So you can imagine a triangle, however you want to picture it, but there are people in DC who are pure reactionaries, who are very afraid of technological change.
You really shouldn't be saying such nasty things about Ed Markey.
Well, I'm not going to single out senators, but there are certainly senators in D.C., and some of them might happen to chair the Commerce Committee, for example, who will just go off on rants about, for example, how kids don't read books these days. And by books, I don't mean iPads, because that's not a book. And what they're really, and this comes out all the time, and what they're really evincing is a deep hostility towards technological change. It's a desire to preserve the world that they grew up in, that they're comfortable with, and a sense that anything else is really unsettling basic values like what it means to read and what it means to learn. But there is another version of that stasis mentality in DC, and this is where people get tripped up, that is pro-technology, that will come out and will say good things about technology and importantly are with us on many issues, like immigration, just for example. They will be our allies a lot of the time. But they're technocrats. Their idea is a different version of a stasis mentality. They know that change is coming. They're in favor of it, but they want to help. They want to steer it, control it. So their values are really about not control in an Orwellian sense. I'm not saying these people are necessarily trying to...
They need to shape it to reflect democratic priorities.
That's a very good summary. And so to me, that's the real conflict, is between that dynamist range of people that are all across the political spectrum who are fundamentally about humility when it comes to DC's ability or Sacramento's ability to control or improve upon the future, who believe that technology can improve the world, but policymakers are not able to do that very well. And then in DC, those two conflicting mentalities. And if you understand that spectrum, I think a lot of the debates that today seem very confusing start to make sense. And importantly, it's not about traditional left-right politics. So it's not surprising that you get the coalitions we've seen on SOPA, on Aaron's Law, on cell phone unlocking. I've got a long list of issues.
Well, let me bring in Larry before we get to that long list of issues. You can't let Berin get away with this. I mean, he's calling everyone in D.C. pretty much, it's a status mentality 1.0, which is reactionary, or status mentality 2.0.
Importantly, stasis.
Statist or stasis?
I'm
willing to mix them.
No,
Berin.
This is not about libertarianism.
I'm trying to bring it back to libertarian. Can't you see where I'm going here? You can't let Berin, Mr. Libertarian Light, get away with this. You need to rise up to either defend the statist or stasis mentality, right?
Right. Wrong. No. So look, I mean, I have a much more pragmatic view, and I've been watching this. I think I'm slightly older than Mike, so I know this is not the first time that we've been at this dance. I remember, John Perry Barlow in the early days of Electronic Frontier Foundation was working very closely with Newt Gingrich when he was House Speaker, and being very surprised that he was working very closely with Newt Gingrich. But Gingrich had whatever else he has. He had a very pro-technology point of view. I agree with Berin. I think actually it's more institutionalized than he suggests, this naivete in the Valley about Washington in particular. Particularly among the venture capital community, there's been this long-standing belief that if you ignore the regulators, they will not harm you. They will go away. And every now and then some disaster occurs, like the Microsoft antitrust suit. Of course, that wasn't Silicon Valley, that was Seattle, so that didn't count. Intel gets in antitrust trouble in Europe, but those are kind of seen as natural disasters that couldn't have been avoided or couldn't, it just happened. And now we'll go on about our business. I've always thought that was a dangerous point of view, but I think it's a more dangerous point of view now for two kind of pragmatic reasons. So I'm going to stay out of the politics and the theory. There's really two main reasons why Washington and the UN and any other regulator has gotten more interested in technological innovations, particularly those that come from here, than they were in the past. One is money. There's much more economic activity.
Are you talking about taxing or coming out here for a Woodside
Taxing.
fundraiser and raising some cash?
Taxing.
Okay.
So if your tax base essentially is moving to cyberspace one way or the other through commerce or through all sort of other activities that happen more and more on the internet and happen less and less in the physical world, then your tax base is migrating. And that, of course, unifies all government as a point of crisis. It's like, well, okay, now we really have to do something about this because otherwise we're out of business. We're out of business in the sense of we have nothing to do, but more importantly, we have no money coming in to do it with. So that's one. The second, I think, thing that's happened is the sort of widening gap in how technology advances. So on the one hand, I often compare sort of the difference in speed of Moore's law, which is kind of nice, easy way of saying technology happens faster all the time. Innovation happens faster all the time, versus government law, which happens at the same pace. It doesn't get faster, and it starts off pretty slow. And so, we've had 60, 50 some years of Moore's law, so the gap just gets wider and wider. The speed of change in technology happens faster. The speed of government, let's just be kind and say it's flat. It's exactly the same. And the bigger the gap gets, the more the sort of opportunity is.
I can't talk you into defending the Obamacare website, can I?
No, well, I haven't looked at it, so I can't. But I think, it's a great example of, the problem, and I'm sure this is the problem, is at the heart of it is the contract cycle process. The sort of government contracting is designed to be slow and deliberative, and when you're trying to do something quickly, you're going to have disasters. And in this case, you're going to have disasters because you're trying to implement new technologies. You put in I did some government contracting in my early days as a systems integrator, and you're agreeing the contract for new computer devices 2 years before they're actually going to go into the field where they're going to be used. You're guaranteed to be contracting for obsolete technology. So that's the government model. And I'm sure, I say I don't know, but I'm very sure that would explain a lot of what's going wrong with the Obamacare website.
Hey, here's another model that maybe I'll throw this out to any of you. There's Paul Graham is well known in this area for his work at Y Combinator, and as an essay that's pretty well read in those circles, the maker versus manager model. And the idea is that the makers should not be interrupted. They need to really focus on creating things, and managers or interruptions are fine. Meetings every 30 minutes, not a problem. Maybe it's more like a programmers versus lawyers model. And it's no coincidence that you have very few programmers in Congress and you have plenty of lawyers. Does that model work? Is it a maker? You've creators out here. No, let me finish. I'm stretching a little.
Jared Polis.
Well, I'm not even really sure he'll self-identify as a programmer, entrepreneur, certainly. But you have, and he's only one. But you have creators out here, and you have regulators, controllers, the libertarians, if there were any on the panel, might say destroyers in D.C. Does that model work?
Yes.
And so then these visions are in conflict, and nothing can be done.
No,
we might as well just go back to dessert and go home.
And I'm sure dessert will be lovely. But before we go,
did look pretty tasty.
I think these two visions are, while in contrast, government being necessarily deliberative and Silicon Valley moving at beyond Moore's law speed. I don't think that government just gets better if practitioners of the Moore's law speed show up there, because even if there are startup founders in the room, if any of you run for Congress, good for you. If you get there, you'll still be one of 435 in the House or one of 100 in the Senate. Even if you're one of one in the White House, you still have these necessarily deliberative checks and balances working both against you in terms of pushing ahead at all speed, and frankly working for you to make sure that what comes out can be good. I look at where technology can fit into this and say technology can make government better. I know that puts me at odds with lots of people on this panel and in this room sometimes, but technology can make government better. And I'll leave it to people like my friend Clay Johnson, who's doing the Department of Better Technology to fix government procurement, and others to talk about the horrendous rollout of healthcare.gov. And as Larry's exactly right, if you're going on that kind of product cycle, spending that kind of money, you're doomed to fail from the start. And any startup founder with this will tell you that. But there are ways for that interaction that can happen between the practitioners, the makers, and the managers to happen without going through an electoral cycle. It's a lot of what we do, frankly, with my organization and Engine Advocacy. We bring the practitioners to Washington. We bring Washington to the practitioners. We've held more than 40 roundtables here in San Francisco and around the country with everybody from Darrell Issa and Jason Chaffetz to Mark Pryor and Julie Brill at the FTC and a whole host of others, where they get a sense of what's happening in startup communities, what challenges are being faced, in some cases on particular bills, what issues are cropping up that could be better, that could better serve the technology community, what sort of regulation could be smarter, that kind of thing. That interaction had not really been happening. It's been happening at the higher levels of technology, where when you are Google or Microsoft or name your big tech company, you can afford to have an army of K Street lobbyists that are marching around and going to every cocktail party and talking with every staffer and making sure that the latest white paper on X, Y, or Z is in front of them. But when you're, two guys at a co-working space or a company of 10 people, working out of an office park somewhere, trying to build a product, you don't have government relations counsel, and frankly, you shouldn't. So that's what we're trying to do, is bring that conversation, convene it, bring it together, because the more that conversation happens, the more exposure that members of Congress or regulators or administration officials get to technology and understand it, or can at least hold it in their hands, even if it's an app and they use it on their phone and they understand it, the more that these arguments don't become abstract. It isn't an abstract argument about patent anymore when we say that if a retailer or a hotelier is getting a patent troll lawsuit because they're providing Wi-Fi to their customers, that maybe, just maybe, some smarter regulation should come into force here. When that conversation gets less abstract and more tangible, that helps us out. Do they need to be in Congress to do it? No. They need to hang out every once in a while? I think so.
Can we have a non-abstract conversation about the National Security Agency and surveillance here, or do we want?
Let me just respond to Mike, if I may. I agree with Mike on two important points. Number one, I think organizations like his are incredibly important. I think there's a yearning need in DC for education, because many people in Congress really, they're technologically, I'm trying to put this in a non-insulting way.
The internet is not a truck? Is that what we're going for?
Well, it's worse than that. I mean, Ted Stevens got demonized for his now famous speech.
But he at least was trying.
He was trying, and quite frankly, and this is the nicest way I can put this, what Ted Stevens said is actually, is not that inaccurate, and B, is far less stupid than the sorts of things that are said at just about every hearing on technology ever.
Oh, yeah.
So the fact that Ted Stevens got beat up for that the way that he did, in some sense it's just how memes work. It just happened. It was on The Daily Show. It was a thing. But there's a constant stream of this sort of thing in D.C., and fixing that really, really will help. And so that's the first thing. Second thing is I actually do think the government can work a lot better. I'm not one of these people who thinks that anything that we do to make government better just makes government bigger and is therefore bad. And that is a certain strain on the right that I think is very dangerous and frankly very childish. It's not a mature approach to government. But it does come from a certain truth, which is that anytime we start engaging with government, trying to improve upon government, getting back to my point about T.J. Rogers, TJ's right that there is a temptation. Government is very seductive to think that hey, we fixed Aaron's Law, we fixed this, we fixed that. Let's do these other things. The government could help us. There are all sorts of things that we could go down our wish list, and that's where I fear that Silicon Valley, as it starts to mature, may in fact be seduced by government and may get into the business, the very thing that T.J. Rogers warned against, that other industries have gotten into, of trying to steer policy in their directions, not merely to make sure that they can hire the employees that they need who happen to live all around the world, or fixing issues like that, but sort of positive agendas of laws that protect certain industries, certain business models that are shaped by people out here who happen to have the strongest lobbies, or positive programs of subsidies or industrial policy So I'll give you one concrete detail. The day that people out here start talking about industrial policy, right, is a day that we will know that Silicon Valley has fundamentally changed, and not for the better. That's not the kind of maturity that I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is maintaining a healthy distance while still being engaged. And we can talk about this after the NSA, but there are a wide range of issues in DC where people who are in favor of technology think that they have the solution. Broadband is a great example where everybody in this room wants there to be more broadband all around the country. We all agree on that. The question is how we do it. And there are a lot of people in DC who take an approach that I can only describe as being very similar to that episode of The Simpsons where Springfield strikes it rich on oil and has all this money to spend and is trying to decide what to do with it. And of course, Phil Hartman's character comes in and sells them on the idea that all they need to do is build the monorail. And somehow, not by fixing Main Street are they going to improve their city, but by pouring money into a particular technology. That's going to change everything. That's technocratic thinking at its best. It's a sort of technocratic thinking that built the monorail in Seattle in real life.
I want to get away from monorails. I want to talk. This is at airports. I was traveling a lot in the last few weeks, and they're very useful. And at airports, I like the airport monorails.
Just briefly.
No. There's no brief. No, we're done with the monorails.
Cut him off. Come on.
Thank you. I'm glad someone else is on my side here. The NSA is the revelations are arguably the biggest news story of the year. So I thought it might actually be useful. Sorry to bring them up over lunch. We're probably not done with the revelations yet. Glenn Greenwald has said in interviews that he has tens of thousands of documents to go through. But it seems like there's a sort of a consensus out here. Silicon Valley companies would like more transparency. I'm not sure if that's and viewed as an end in itself or just a way to say, well, maybe if there's more transparency, the prosecutors and intelligence analysts, that is the NSA, will seek fewer orders for surveillance, and also there's probably this subtext of let us clear our names. I mean, the people think that the companies listed as participating in the so-called PRISM program are opening their networks, and if they can say, well, we get like 20 requests a year, people, the American public might think that's reasonable. But we don't have DC saying, sure, more transparency, not a problem. I mean, they might say that, but they don't mean it. Any thoughts? You haven't been in the discussion recently. Are we going to see real change in terms of either transparency or the programs themselves as a result? And how's this going to affect the companies out here?
Well, that might happen, but I just want to first challenge one of your assumptions here, which is that these are revelations. The truth is there's a lot of new specifics that we're getting, but there is nothing in the Snowden material that wasn't already known at the time of the last set of updates to FISA and the Patriot Act. And there were lots of people, including people in Washington.
NSA weakening encryption standards?
Yes.
Where were the New York Times articles about
exactly,
that? Point me to one. Okay,
that's the point.
It wasn't known.
It was Julian Sanchez was telling everybody who would listen. He was attending all the hearings, and nobody, Mike is here, so I can't say nobody. Nobody paid attention. So part of it is
he's a real libertarian. We should have had him on this.
Julian, yeah. And I also have to say I was wrong because I assumed when the Snowden story broke, it was like, okay, this is going to be news for about 2 months until there's a tornado or a hurricane or some other natural disaster. Something's going to come along and it's going to go away. Well, it hasn't gone away, and now I'm not so sure what's going to happen. But I think what I would like
Silicon Valley wants reform, at least in transparency, maybe in the programs themselves. Is it going to happen? Yes or no, Counselor?
Maybe transparency. Maybe more transparency. And then we'll and if we get the transparency, then we'll know what else to reform.
I mean, isn't a useful mental model, folks, that politicians say what they want, so they can come out here and go to Woodside and Atherton and have very nice fundraisers, maybe Portola Valley if they're slumming, and then walk away and then nothing really happens.
That's usually the case, but sometimes accidents happen.
It doesn't happen. Accidents happen. Okay, I'll go with that.
Something has to happen here. Even Dianne Feinstein, the senator from the other California, has come out in favor of transparency reforms because she, who is perhaps the biggest hawk and defender of the NSA in Congress, even she realizes that politically she has to stop the bleeding. So the question, I think, is not whether something happens. The question is whether it's the bare minimum of what people like her think needs to happen versus actually really dealing with the problem. So there's transparency, and then there's transparency. There's, do you actually turn the FISA court into a real court where you have an adversarial process instead of the government going to a judge and saying, oh no, just trust us, and then lying? Or do you actually deal with the underlying problems of what the law allows? And so I think the question
Anything, apparently. Everything.
The question is, how far does that go? And unfortunately, it's a really hard issue. I mean, like literally a hard issue. It's hard to understand. It's hard to understand the moving parts. There's a lot of basic technological ignorance that intimidates members of Congress and makes them reluctant to get their arms around something, which is in part why it's important to engage with them and make sure they understand the basic issues. So when something like this happens, they're ready to jump in. But I will say that just to put DC in perspective, I think it's very sad that while this NSA controversy has been now going for months and months and months,
4 months,
Congress is still sitting on the other privacy reform that was almost ready to go, which is fixing law enforcement's access to data by making sure that if they want to get your emails or track you using your cell phone, that they have to get a warrant. That should be uncontroversial. That bill has over 140 co-sponsors in the House, and it all got tied up in the Senate for basically because the Securities and Exchange Commission wanted an exemption for themselves. And then just to give you a sense of how DC works, despite all the attention that's being paid to privacy now, the one privacy reform that could be passed tomorrow, that people understand where the hard work's been done, is now languishing for lack of attention.
So let me put this in perspective.
One thing on that.
Wait.
I don't know that it's lack of attention.
Wait.
All right.
Just you will be the next person to jump in. But I just wanted to put this in perspective and say, what Berin's talking about is an effort to reform privacy laws. You had the ACLU and Americans for Tax Reform and all these groups on the left and the right signing on to this. You had Apple and Microsoft and AT&T and Google and Twitter and all these companies pouring money into this lobbying effort. It's been going on for about half a decade, and it failed because Senator Leahy just didn't really feel like doing anything with it. So this is a failure, folks. This is a failure of the political process. Mike, it's the next word.
I don't know that it's a failure of the political process. I think what we need to do, and it's not lack of attention. I mean, I think that we had the Stop Watching Us rallies over the weekend where you had a lot of at least support, on the internet, and in some cases, rallying, where you had people that are up in arms about, this assault on privacy, and they want to do something about it. But that's the problem. They want to do something, not let's pass this law, let's change this regulation, and let's focus the debate here, here, and here. And the problem is, DC as a culture only has so many inputs. And machine gun firing, we hate you at them, isn't going to solve anybody's problems anywhere. So it's exactly what you said. I don't think it's the lack of attention. I think it is the lack of focus on the community at large that is trying to push and advocate for substantive changes that will make it harder for the NSA to break encryption or for us to tap Angela Merkel's cell phone, which, by the way, must have been spectacularly boring material to read from national security. I love Angela Merkel just fine, but sorry,
Actually, I want to know, that moment where George Bush gave her the back rub? That famous moment. It was the best moment of the Bush presidency.
Yeah.
I want to know what she said afterwards. There's a record of that somewhere.
It's somewhere, yeah. I feel as though a chip has been implanted in my back. No. Jon Stewart did that better. The point is this. We got to focus that debate, right? We got to pick the 2 to 3 areas whether it's the ready to go or whether it's the things that have been in process, and say, okay, senators, congressmen, regulators, here is where we need the fixes. We want to see change in these areas through these vehicles. Go and do your job. Not, we hate the NSA. That doesn't, it's a nice sort of catharsis and experience for people to go and see their friends all in agreement with them and shout, but it doesn't get anything done. You got to focus that.
Well, why can't you have a bright line? I'll get to you next, Berin. But saying, okay, we're going to have a coalition of groups that more or less represent all that is well and good within the technology space, and we're going to have some bright lines. If you support this bill, we're going to support you. If you vote against it, then we're going to try to vote your ass out at the next primary, and we'll throw a lot of money at it too. Isn't that a nice bright line that channels this? Why hasn't this been done, Berin?
Well, look. The point that I was trying to make, I think, is very consistent with.
You're not answering the question. Answer my question and get to your point.
Okay, so if you're talking about political advocacy,
yes.
So the basic answer is, I think that
coupled with policy.
Yeah. Well, this is the point. So visions, as Thomas Sowell once said, are the silent shapers of our thoughts. So visions, this term that I use at the beginning here, they really do matter because that's what unites everything else. It gives effect. It helps us to connect to things that we see in the real world. And if you don't see political activism on a particular point, it's probably because the underlying psychology of the issue isn't really there yet. So in other words, here, people they don't have a sufficiently coherent understanding of privacy such that when they get all worked up about the NSA... Are you saying
that you're a Washingtonian coming here and saying we're dumb?
No, you have better things to do than worry about this. And this is where T.J. Rogers is right? So I want to live in a world where people in Silicon Valley don't have to spend a lot of their mental space on this. But they're always going to have to spend some of it. And they have to have effective advocates, people like Mike, writers like Larry, hopefully organizations like TechFreedom, who carry their message not just in DC, but in the broader conversation so that, for example, when something like the NSA story happens, the punchline isn't just NSA equal bad. The punchline is government has too easy access to our data. We do need to fix the NSA, but there are other things we have to fix too, like ECPA reform. So the point that I was trying to make about ECPA reform is that the fact that the dots haven't been connected yet helps to illustrate how immature, not just Silicon Valley, but the broader popular discourse about technology is. Because in a better world, when something like that happens, the story that comes out of it is, the top 3 things that could be done today are, ECPA, NSA transparency and fixing the FISA court, tackling the underlying surveillance laws, but let's not forget about law enforcement, which still has access. Let's not forget about the fact that in most states in this country, lawyers in divorce cases are officers of the court, so can compel email records or other sorts of things like that. That's a huge story that right now gets swept aside because everyone's too focused on the NSA. So to answer your question about politics, I think it's when those understandings are more clear, when people have a better developed understanding of how government should approach technology, that you will see more effective political activism of the kind that you referenced.
I still don't. I wanted an answer.
I want to take on your question.
This is. I want a litmus test.
So
are you? This is a good guy or a bad guy?
There's a political, and look, there are very few times in politics where there are good guys and bad guys, and those lines are clearly delineated. And unfortunately, those, to borrow the line from the West Wing, those days usually end with body counts, right? Like that's where there aren't many good guys and bad guys all the time, everywhere, black and white. It's clearly delineated stuff. In politics, which is the argument we're talking about here, there are 3 things that win elections: money, media, and feet on the street. Tech is very good at media.
I was going to say votes.
But that's how, so the point, it's like runs created in baseball. The point is to score. Everything's about baseball for me. And by the way, if the new follower is on Twitter, and welcome to all of you, sorry about all the screaming that's going to happen during the World Series. But everything's about baseball. Runs created are how you gauge whether or not a team is good, whether they win or lose. Votes are how you determine whether or not you win or lose an election. How do you get votes? Money, media, and feet on the street. Tech is very good at the media side of this, and they're getting more savvy every day. Not just the all-encompassing, the blue state digitals, the Obama campaigns, even Project Orca for the Romney campaign, things like that. There's more that's happening and more sort of a decentralized way of using the tools that are out there, whether it's social media, YouTube, whatever, to get your message out there. They're very good at that. On the money side, what tech has done is support candidates where they say, well, you're good on the social issues. So this gets back to your point of, do Republicans just have to get good on social issues to be popular in Silicon Valley? Well, I'd like for them to get good on social issues, and I think that would make them more popular in Silicon Valley. But I don't think that's also the be-all and end-all. We've got to get more mature as a culture in technology and in the Valley and beyond to understand that we're not going to agree with people all the time, and that there will be people with whom we do not agree all the time that deserve our support, because they will support the kind of changes that we need to make our businesses more effective and to make the kinds of messages that we want to drive in our private life, whether it's we're creating again applications or we're making some product or whatever it is.
Someone,
but if there's support
if a politician is anti-gay marriage and anti-abortion and loves driving large pickup trucks instead of a Prius, but is going to vote well on patents, then you're okay with supporting that politician.
I mean, it's the oldest trick in the book is that politicians make strange bedfellows, and you'd be surprised. I am surprised, and my father is just super angry with me at how many Republicans I spend time with. I think Jerry Moran, the senator from Kansas, is a super nice guy and is really good on technology and entrepreneurship. And I don't talk about other things with him because we don't agree, and that's fine. I don't agree with everybody I'm friends with. You know, Lord knows, there's one or two Yankee fans that I'm friends with. So
it does all go back to baseball.
They slip in.
But let me bring Larry into this.
Yes, we have to understand what our interests are.
Okay, strange benefits, narrow targeted coalitions. Yeah. Larry.
Yeah.
Do you agree with this? This man may be crazy.
Well, I really don't have the capacity to understand electoral politics. I don't really, frankly, care. I mean, Berin's right. In some ways, I'm one of those people that thinks, look, the technology is going to solve the problem one way or the other anyway. All governments are going to do is, sort of skew the trajectory, stop things, slow things down. But ultimately, technology is going to have its way. What I'm more concerned about is the policy stuff. And I think what we were talking about before, it really boils down to, it's much easier to stop SOPA than it is to rewrite the FISA law. Because when you've got a bill, you just hate it, you want it dead. Okay, that's, you put your mob out on Congress, they got the message, and the bill went away.
He's calling your supporters a mob,
But I will say this, part of the reason we were able to defeat SOPA was not simply because we put the mob out there. It was a coordinated media campaign, and the fact that thanks to the efforts of someone like, Darrell Issa, and I'm supporting the man who brought you the California recall here, right? But he put out the Open Act with a bunch of other co-sponsors, which said, okay, SOPA's not good, but here's this other idea that's a little better. Can we maybe find some common ground here? Now, everybody got wind of the fact that SOPA was terrible, and then it was killed.
This is mob plus.
But if we were trying to, if the goal had been to fix 6 provisions of SOPA, and there were discussions early on where we said, all right, well, we need this out, this change, this out, this. There was a constructive look at the actual statute, and I think if you were trying to rally the troops behind, the 6 key changes to SOPA that would have made it not catastrophic, you would have had a much harder time getting the campaign to go the direction it went, and the speed it went, and the size that it went. Then it's much easier to say, we got to kill SOPA.
Yeah, but that's the focus of all mass campaigns like that. I mean, I was taking meetings in the Capitol and the office buildings on January 18th and telling people it's not if we're going to win, it's how bad we're going to lose. Right. And trying to fix those 6 provisions while the gathering horde was with their pitchforks and torches out at the gates, threatening to get in. But that's how, that's the difference between the mass campaign and the inside game. And you got to be able to get savvy enough to do both and do it well.
No, I agree completely.
Now, at some point, I want to take questions from the audience, and do we have a microphone that can be circulated? Don't make me keep these folks from attacking each other. Maybe you can do a better job of it. So please, if you could identify yourself, that would be great.
Hi, can everybody hear me? I'm Bob Zeidman. I wanted to bring up an issue since you mentioned SOPA and PIPA. I assume you're lumping them together. For people who don't know, SOPA and PIPA were House and Senate bills to shut down websites that had stolen intellectual property on them. And so I just want to make a comment. I'd like to hear everybody's opinion about it. But it seems to me that, you talk about strange bedfellows and see that, stopping SOPA as being a good thing because we got Republicans and Democrats together. But I look at Darrell Issa, who's a man that in almost every other area I really like. And in his intellectual property issues, I really dislike. I think he's doing a disservice. So libertarians, and the principle of libertarian is property ownership. And so there is, we can debate whether intellectual property is property. But also libertarians in general believe, I think maybe all of them believe, that government's one, main purpose is to protect someone from taking your property. And so why is it? It's frustrating to me to see so many libertarians trying to attack the intellectual property laws. In other words, we wouldn't say if somebody was selling your credit card online, we'd think the government had a legitimate reason for shutting that site down. But if they're selling your book or your articles online, we somehow think that should be free. And I'm frustrated by libertarians and conservatives who say, yeah, that's government intervention. But that's the place that I think we should have government intervention.
This is a divisive issue within the libertarian movement and conservative movement as well, and this division has been going on for over a decade, and so it's not a new thing. But if you believe that IP is property, then you're your point is well taken, but that not everyone believes that IP is property, in part because you have things like fair use, in part because it's actually treated differently under federal law. Does anyone want to respond to this?
Without getting into the intellectual property, debate on whether it is or whether it isn't, I'll leave that to both smarter people than me, and I'll just leave it to them. But let's put this in a different context. Let's assume that it is property. So it's in the same way. You're a cattle rancher in West Texas, and you think that one of your neighbors has been rustling your cattle and taking some away. You don't then get to go napalm his farm and execute his family. That's the difference between what SOPA was trying to do. I absolutely agree that hardworking artists and creators need protection. I don't think they should have the ability to break the underpinnings of the internet to do that, and that's what SOPA was threatening to do. So I would say that...
One quick thing, that's a big rumor, and some people like Lars
No.
and Mark, look, I do this for a living, okay?
Okay.
Nobody's going to break the internet. That's preposterous, but that's the fear that was put out there. I think
By him, by the way.
By me. I'm the guy, so you're welcome.
Okay.
And Mike.
So listen, I've often said that copyright is the Vietnam of tech policy. It's a total quagmire, and it's the last thing that we want to get stuck on.
No, I think we spend the next 30 minutes talking about nothing but
so this is
libertarians on tech policy. I don't think that's me this time. I think that's you.
So here, look, I'll just say that one thing about the big picture and the one thing about substance. Big picture, one of the very serious problems that Silicon Valley has is that it gets so stuck on copyright. I understand that it's important to people on both sides of the issue, but there are people on both sides of the issue that get so stuck on that they can't talk about anything else. And just to give you a data point, so I've now been in the think tank world for going on 6 years, and every year I get summer fellow applications to spend the summer with us, mostly from law students. And about 80% of them, and I mean that, about 80% of them write an essay that basically says, I want to go into internet policy because I'm fascinated by copyright. And I got into this debate on either side. Usually it's pro Larry Lessig, usually it's copyright skepticism. But either side, it's sort of the central galvanizing issue of tech policy. And I think it's a huge problem because it ends up distracting us from other issues that matter a lot. And then just briefly on substance, I will say I support copyrights in general, but we were very skeptical and critical of both SOPA and PIPA. And the issue is, frankly, from my perspective, is not even really a copyright law issue. It's a mechanism of enforcement issue. And so I would actually modify the analogy that Mike offered earlier. I would say something more like, it's like if you suspect that a particular person has stolen your cattle, do you get to napalm them and their neighbors? In other words, there's a lot of collateral damage involved there, and the question is about trade-offs. And in general,
we're starting to spend too much time on this, folks.
It's a utilitarian enterprise. There's no clear, easy answer.
And subject to special interest lobbying on both sides. Take next question,
and
please.
Process failure.
We have
a
a microphone.
One point. Part of the reason we started Engine was because we wanted to move away from the copyright fight into things that matter.
He can't respond.
So to Beren's point, it was
let's
broaden the tech policy.
Okay, there is a microphone in the back. It's going to the gentleman with his hand up. If you could identify yourself. Hopefully you work for Hollywood and also want to criticize libertarians on IP.
Please no.
Hi,
Come on.
I'm John Chisholm. Thank you so much for this interesting panel. This is not my question, but if I may make a comment about intellectual property, the only patent protection that I can think of that would make sense would be covering the invention from that period of time from which it was created until the world at large would have thought of the idea anyway. And I would think that the 17 or 20 years that patents have existed were broadly intended to reflect that. It might not have, or let's say they did reflect that, even if that was not their intent. Well, the pace of innovation inexorably is increasing every decade. And so at minimum, it seems to me that the duration of a patent ought to decline every decade, maybe by some systematic predictable amount, like 10% every 10 years. So I haven't heard anyone in the public sphere talk about it that way or suggest that, but it seems to me something we might consider. Okay, so that's now to my question, which is for Berin. I really like and find appealing your model of stasis versus dynamicists, if I've gotten the two
Dynamists.
words. What was it?
Dynamists. It's a tough word. It sounds like
Dynamicists.
Dianetics.
Okay.
It's a terrible problem.
Well, I just finished reading Tyler Cowen's book, Average is Over, which I highly recommend. And one of the things he points out in the last chapter is that he talks about inequality, rising inequality, at least of incomes in the U.S., and addresses what you often hear as the concern that's raised about that, which is that there will be mass uprisings in the U.S. akin to what we saw in the 1960s, perhaps, if we allow this to continue. And he responds to that by saying, the U.S. population is aging. We're getting older. We're getting more conservative. That seems unlikely to him, and so he's not very worried about that. My question is, what effect does the aging of the U.S. population have on the mix of folks who are stasists versus
Dynamists.
dynamicists?
So, dynamists. See, this is the problem with that word.
You need to rebrand.
How about
Sorry, you can only take Virginia
Yeah.
Post Trail so far.
So actually, that's a great question. And let me just say, I just happened to go back home to New Mexico last weekend and happened to find I'm from Albuquerque. I found a filing cabinet of my father's papers. This was the problem that he wrote about. Basically, was the effect of aging and how it influences attitudes towards risk, both among industrial managers and among politicians. So this is, you might say, I come by this honestly, and you're exactly right that genetically and psychologically we do become more conservative, more statist, more obsessed with preserving things the way that they were when we were growing up as we get older. And the question is, what do we do about it? So one thing that he proposed in one of the papers I happened to pick up and read through was age limits for public office. It's a variant on the idea of term limits. The idea is that at some point people probably should just usher themselves out of the public sphere because they have a hard time adjusting to a changing world. I will only say that if you want to see whether that's a good idea, just watch a hearing sometime and judge for yourself. Because you get a pretty good sense pretty quickly of people's comfort level with technology across the political spectrum, whatever they think about the issue. It is a serious problem, and in particular, and the single thing that I think would make the biggest difference to these issues, because the idea of age limits for office is not realistic. It's never going to happen. What is realistic, and then what is really important, this is the kind of thing that changes Washington that maybe people here tend to undervalue, is term limits on committee chairmen. So the problem is in D.C., and we have this now in the House, because they changed their rules that the Republicans did this when they came in. The problem is if you get people who are sitting too long on a particular subject area, they're the congressional barons. They rule that area, and they continue to think of it the way that they knew it way back when. Every hearing you get to involves one of those people saying, well, back in 1996, when we wrote the Telecommunications Act, based on understanding of technology from 1992, before the internet was a thing, let me tell you how we did things. And it's totally irrelevant. It has nothing to do with the real world. So, short answer is, I'm deeply concerned about that very problem. But I do find some reason for optimism in some of the basic neurological work that's coming out that suggests that our brains are more plastic than we used to think. There was this old idea that after the age of 25, you basically couldn't evolve or change. And that apparently is just not true. We are actually more capable of evolving and changing. So I have both reason for concern in the short term and in the long term. I think people are probably more able to adjust than we might give them credit for, but they're still going to be stuck in that stasis mentality. And frankly, you need ultimately a vibrant voice of youth that is willing to advocate for change.
But how do you balance that with the need for institutional memory?
Well, the answer in D.C. is congressional staff. So, for example, I think one of the most naive idea on the political right in the United States, and I mean this, is the idea of term limits. in general, because the idea is, well, if we limit members of Congress to 3 terms in the House and 2 terms in the Senate, our politics will change.
Okay,
what actually?
Let me
finish the point.
Term limits.
Let me finish the point.
We're getting a little far afield
Declan.
from Diane. What was that
Declan.
again? Diane.
The point is, the actual effect of that, and this may be true for the idea that I threw out earlier about committee leadership. The actual effect is to empower staff. Because the real problem in D.C., ultimately, we can talk about members of Congress and lawmakers. The thing that people don't really understand is that the people who actually wield power are the staffers, for better and worse. And this is, of course, the point.
So you're talking about term limits for staff. Okay, we've heard it here
first. This is a
first.
problem that's never going to change.
Let's go to the next question, please, and identify yourself if you could.
Hi, Luther Lowe from Yelp. I want to talk about SOPA PIPA in my question, but sort of as a point to move beyond it here. So it seemed like with SOPA PIPA you had an alignment between the end user interests as well as the industry coming together, and that's why you had sort of this perfect storm. And it was for being against something. If you contrast that with H-1B, we're not seeing the switchboards getting fried over H-1B because that's industry interests. Or if you look at CISPA, where you have a lot of the same kind of grassroots folks that were against SOPA PIPA in conflict with industry. My question is what issues are out there where Team Internet, so to speak, can put some points on the board rather than being against something? In the case of SOPA PIPA, we were against something, and it was the interest of the end users and industry aligned. What issues exist where the interests of the end users and the industry are aligned and we're affirmatively advocating for something?
This was a good example because it cleared the House twice, even though the advocacy groups hated it. Also, you can go back to the encryption wars of the 1990s. Advocacy groups hated the encryption export controls, and it wasn't until industry started throwing lots of money at the problem in the late 90s that they eventually disappeared. But that doesn't answer your question. Larry answers your question.
So, first of all, I agree with you that the other stuff, the immigration reform, the tax reform, patents, copyrights, spectrum reform, all the other stuff, it's harder, and I don't think that means we shouldn't work to make the user base understand that, yes, immigration reform is important to you, even though, it's an indirect way. But I think the one that's clearly happening now that's working quite well, although it's a little early, so maybe that's premature, is in the sharing economy, where you've got, sort of companies, again, the Airbnbs and the Ubers and so on, who are facing, in this case, more likely state and local regulators, throwing a bunch of regulations at them that were written at a time when things were very different, the technology, and so on and so forth. And you're getting nice alignment, I think, between the startups, their interests, and their customers, their users, and they're being very effective, obviously, at using social media as a way of sort of militarizing their users to show up at city council meetings, to light up the switchboards at the California Public Utilities Commission. It's a good model, I think, for that kind of alignment. But we need to definitely apply it to some of these bigger issues, not just because they're really, really important to internet users. They just don't know it.
Yeah, I think the sharing economy point's a really good one, and I think that's one where this gets a lot more diffuse, and it does go down to the state and local level. I mean, you got to understand that Uber and the Uber love hashtag, by the way, and we can talk about loving corporations another day, but here we are. The Uber is fighting people like the sealer of weights and measures in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So that's usually not something that would, get people out in force, like you need taxi meters, you don't need taxi meters. But it's a product that they use that has worth to them, so they do it. And there's a very tangible way that they can go and say they'll be a part of it. So yes, I think the sharing economy thing and the ability for people to enjoy those products and make money off of those products, to make a living off of those products, is going to be really important. I want to say one point on immigration. It's not just tech. So this is a fight about comprehensive immigration reform when it came right down to it. And there were a lot of, in the early days of this, and we've been working on this for quite some time, not as long as many immigration advocates, but from a technology perspective, we've been working on it for a while. And the thing of it is, the original push and pull was, okay, do we just look for like an H-1B bill and maybe a startup visa and do those alone? And the broader political context was, nope, this is going to be about comprehensive. And so now it's trying to find the cracks in the floodgates so that we're able to get House Republicans to act and a comprehensive attempt at reforming an immigration system that is fundamentally broken. That's the only thing that's going to become law under the current circumstance. And so we have a stalemate right now. I don't think, Luther, that it's that technology has not made a difference. I think there are many groups out there, us, Forward.us, Partnership for New American Economy, and on down the line, and so many more that have had an impact in that debate. But we are one constituency in a much broader fight that goes well beyond our own borders. And that is the political reality that we're dealing with. And so we have got to double down and make sure that we find those cracks and we get the Republicans in the House to keep that ball moving in the right direction. It's the only thing that's going to move. So until we do that, we're kind of stuck.
So we at TechFreedom spent a lot of time thinking about this question. What are the positive issues that we can advocate on? We've already talked about NSA reform. We talked about ECPA. I'll give you a few other quick examples. Number one, positive agenda is celebrating what I think is the cornerstone of internet freedom. Section 230 is the law that immunizes websites from the comments that are posted by their users. You scrap that, you tweak it, as the state attorneys general almost unanimously recently proposed to do, to make sites liable under state law, and you break many of the websites, many of the sharing economy websites that have allowed users not only to create content, but also to do innovative things like Airbnb and Uber. Very similarly, in principle to that, but in terms of a positive change that needs to be made and not something that has to be stopped, anti-SLAPP legislation is something that civil rights groups have been, journalists have been pushing for many years because they've been the victims of strategic lawsuits against public participation. But that's now a really important issue for companies like Yelp, for every website out there, because if their users can be sued by a dentist or someone that they review, where they say, I'm going to sue you, I'm going to file a BS defamation claim, that's enough to discourage many people from posting content in the first place. That's a great issue that I think this community could win on and demonstrate that we can actually not just stop things, but make a difference in the real world. But two other quick things.
One other quick thing.
Two other quick things. I bought you lunch, Declan.
It was a nice lunch.
Promoting broadband, right? We spend all the time in the world in D.C. arguing about net neutrality. There's a lot of agreement, though, on the need to open up spectrum, let people put up cell phone towers to make wireless service work better, and make it easier to build competitive networks. Those are all things that D.C. could be doing now that we don't, because we spend all this time arguing about really stupidly partisanized issues like net neutrality. The final thing, the big battle that I see coming over the next year, is already starting. We discussed it earlier when we talked about Angela Merkel. Countries like Germany and Brazil are reacting to the NSA scandal in the worst possible way, to say that they can't abide U.S. censorship, fair, and in response, they're going to cut off flows of data to and from the U.S. They're going to require that data about their citizens be located on servers in their country, and perhaps also to prevent those companies from actually serving in those countries. What that actually means, as Cameron Carey said,
is that we're getting very far afield from D.C. versus San Francisco. We're now talking Europeans verers U.S.
Well,
there's a difference. Even I know that.
Brussels is sort of the more extreme version of D.C. Brussels is pure technocrats.
Well, points for making that strained analogy.
We'll do this next month in Brussels.
It absolutely is. Point is, that's the next big fight. You want to talk about openness of the internet? That's being threatened right now by people who are saying the right things about censorship and fighting the NSA, but who are responding to it by putting up or proposing to put up what
even though
Cameron
their
Carey
intelligence
said,
agencies do the same thing. Okay, next
what
question.
Cameron
We
Carey
have
called
a
another
question
great firewall.
over where? Identify yourself, please. There is a microphone en route to you.
Hi, I'm Christopher Rasmussen with Health Privacy Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology. And I'm kind of glad that you brought up Obamacare, and I'll try to keep this to the relevant to the conversation of DC versus SF. But a lot of the conversation, I think, related to the healthcare.gov website a lot of the conversation about Obamacare has focused on the healthcare.gov website. And I think what's missing from the discussion is the relative success of our state exchange, Covered California, versus the healthcare.gov website. And to tie this back into our conversation today, I'm wondering if you think that some of the reason that the state-based exchanges have been more successful is that they are, in fact, the policies aren't, in fact, being honed in at the state level, and whether, to tie this back into a more libertarian discussion, is federalism. Is there a role? Is there a more successful model of tech policy done at the state house level versus the congressional level, and what your thoughts are on that?
If you try to run technology policy at the state level, you're going to end up with 50. You're going to end up with the EU problem. Frankly, you're going to end up with 50 different statutes on privacy policies and things like that for app developers, which are totally. You're never going to be able to navigate that and have an effective product. I mean, this is the 27 different iTunes example out of Europe, right? This is the issue. There is a role for wider adoption of a lot of these regulations and wider oversight, so that you don't, as a practitioner, you don't have to navigate so many different systems in a way that demeans your end product and that ends up costing you profits and revenue and profit. The exchange, the healthcare.gov example is interesting. My favorite tweet of this whole thing is, what doesn't need a website to work? Single-payer healthcare. That's the kind of stuff that gets you in jail in a room like this. But it's one of those things where this massive liberal government spending plan brought to you by Mitt Romney and the Heritage Foundation isn't working because it's just so handcuffed. There's 50 different data systems, right, for each of the state healthcare, and then you have all the different companies and all of their needs and all the rest of it. And there is a piece that technology can play here in simplifying and codifying and bringing that kind of data up to where we are. In a lot of cases, they're finally moving off of like paper and pen and putting stuff like this online. So there is a role that technology can play in this. My view as a big government liberal socialist is that more of that oversight, more ability for more people in this country to play in that system is better than sectioning it off by state.
I would just say the lesson that I take from this is that if government's going to subsidize something, they still shouldn't be in the business of running it. This was Milton Friedman's point about public education. His idea was, look, if we want to subsidize education, give vouchers, but don't have government run the schools. And this is where I think, to get back to the DC versus San Francisco concept, this is where I think you can have agreement that whatever government's role, however big the welfare state is going to be, there are some things that government's just not very good at. And while I think government could do a better job with tech, while tech could improve government, I don't think we ever want to rely on government getting tech right. So whatever government's role is, sites like that should be built by the private sector.
The argument I was trying to make is that healthcare.gov is the one that suffered the challenges, but if you focus the policy of building a website at the state level, a lot of the states have been much more successful. So Sacramento, and not just blue states, but red states like Kentucky have had a successful implementation. So maybe we can argue about whether or not government should be involved in building websites, but at least the federalist argument that states can sometimes do it better.
I like the federalist argument, but let's not have arguments from the audience. Let's have questions from the audience. We have enough arguments going on up here, but your point's well taken. Yes, we have someone over here with who's waiting for a microphone. Ed, it's all yours. If you could identify yourself, that would be lovely.
Ed Hurst. And I want to relate it to DC, San Francisco, and there was a reference to Team Internet earlier, which might be interpreted as San Francisco. And I think some of the comments earlier about the EU might be relevant to this, but my question is Team Internet really sabotaging the Internet in the B2B space? And by that, what I mean is that, all the people who are concerned about the NSA revelations, it's sort of red meat for the rednecks, or not for the rednecks, but for the Team Internet, red meat, they sort of leap at the media disclosures about Merkel, which really has nothing to do with the future of the Internet. If that is really undermining us in the long run, you mentioned Brazil and the EU, but if by virtue of
Can you put your mic closer?
Yeah, we can't hear you very well over here. But
closer to your mouth.
Just close.
Sorry.
Close.
So can you hear
That
me
works.
now? Okay, good. So the question is, if by virtue of Team Internet and Silicon Valley really revving up over all the NSA issues, if that really exacerbates the inherent protectionist instincts in other countries, and if Washington reacts, as it has been, to Team Internet by saying, oh, we got to change this on the NSA, we've got to do this hearings, that generates opposition, not just in Europe and Brazil, but in China, throughout Asia. And the impact on it is directly relevant. It's not an esoteric thing. If you look at companies like, not just Salesforce, which is here we all know, but Workday, ServiceNow, Splunk, Marketo, all of the business cloud companies that depend on cross-border data flows, maybe because of this lack of connection between the outside Team Internet, Facebook-focused groups versus the B2B interest that we have, that generates so much negative PR. It gives the excuse for protectionism against the U.S. And if the Valley should have a more mature attitude about these things, to recognize that what we say here, if that has an impact on D.C., that has an impact on our companies, and we could lose the B2B lead we have because other countries, we're giving them the tools to stop it with.
So you're saying that because Silicon Valley companies, especially maybe the ones listed in the PRISM document, are not talking enough, the world might start using non-U.S. companies for cloud computing services?
No, not quite. It's more that because people get so excited about the NSA issues, and you find, like, whether it's Yahoo or Facebook, Facebook's a little different, but we don't want to cooperate with the NSA, they're making us, there's all these, we just love to tell you, there have been so many instances of this. If people were not to push that as hard, and if the internet community were not to push that as hard, it would provide less ammunition for foreign governments that inherently want to support national champions, and they're using all the angst about Snowden as an excuse to do discriminatory measures against our companies. So France would love to have their own equivalent of Salesforce or Workday or Splunk or ServiceNow or Marketo or any of the other new companies that are coming up. This helps provide them the excuse for doing it. It's hard for us to defend. So if USTR wants to go to Beijing and tell the Chinese they shouldn't require a communications license for American B2B companies, enterprise software B2B companies like the ones I named in all the different subsectors, the Chinese can say, well, even you guys are concerned about Snowden.
Right. So let's say European and other countries be holier than thou, even though their spy agencies do the same thing. And if you look at maybe the stats coming out of the Netherlands, they're the wiretap capital of the world per capita, and we're way down, you're Canada at the bottom. There's holier than thou. True?
Yeah. So look, I somewhat agree with you, but I think in some ways it's kind of starting to blame the victim. I think there's sort of two kinds of countries in the world outside the U.S. There's countries who want financially to be more successful with technology, and they look for any excuse to find ways to disadvantage American-based companies. Then there's also the repressive regimes, the China's, Iran's, and North Korea's, who want, in fact, they want to end U.S. censorship so they get better access to their own forms of censorship. And they will,
it would be convenient if Google moved Gmail servers to China.
Well, the point is,
if
for them,
the Chinese secret police.
So this came up obviously last year with the International Telecommunications Union and the conference that happened in Dubai in December. Is you have a lot of governments who are very jealous of U.S. interests for different reasons, and they will look for any excuse to say we need to take governance as much as we can away from the U.S. as a country. Now, as far as the NSA stuff is concerned, the problem, as I said at the beginning, all along has been at least transparency and oversight in the FISA law and the Patriot Act. Not talking about that is not going to stop these other countries from using the revelations. I think the best thing to do is to get it out in the open, find out what the actual issues are, fix the transparency problems, fix the oversight problems, and then go back to being holier than everybody else and saying, our censorship is at least democratically, enabled, and yours isn't.
So again, mark my words, this is the fight that we will be focused on over the next year. This is round 2 of the fight that happened over the ITU, trying to take over governance of the internet. There was an alliance between states that wanted more control and certain companies, especially in Europe, that wanted to have international regulations to allow them to recover more of their costs. They lost, and this is the fight that they're now picking. And the point that I was trying to make earlier, before Declan was, trying to get me to wind up, I actually did have a point.
I actually succeeded.
But I actually did have a point to make, which is Cameron Carey, when he left as general counsel of the Commerce Department, this is John Kerry's brother, he put this better than anybody possibly could, and in really strong terms, he said it would be a sad outcome of the surveillance disclosures if they led to an approach to internet policymaking and governance in which countries became a series of walled gardens with governments holding the keys to locked gates. But that is where we will wind up if all data has to stay located on servers in the nation in which a country lives or where a device is located. The digital world does not need another great firewall in Europe or anywhere else. In other words, he compared the Europeans' efforts, and for that matter Brazilians' efforts, to protect their citizens to the Chinese efforts to prevent their citizens from accessing a larger internet. This is the coming fight about internet openness. And quite frankly, the area where I'm very disappointed in this administration, just as I was about Guantanamo and lots of other civil liberties issues, is this administration's response to the NSA scandal was essentially to say, we did nothing wrong, we are protecting Americans. What they could have said, which would have been just slightly different, was we are trying to combat terrorism, or whatever. But as Tocqueville said about America, America's greatness lies not in its superiority over other nations, not in that it is more enlightened, but in its ability to fix its faults. And so if we had come through this experience by actually doing something about the NSA, bringing more transparency to the process, ensuring that we had a real court, which is something that holds the U.S. above every other country in the world in principle, in most areas, that we have a warrant requirement for things like access to content. If we had fixed those things quickly, we could have headed this all off at the pass. And the problem now is we didn't, and now politicians in Europe, they're finding out that they themselves, personally, have been spied on. And so they're now joining the fight, where last time they were on our side against the ITU, they're now joining the fight. So there's this growing cabal that is joining forces against the current model of internet governance. And quite frankly, unless the U.S. moves very quickly on things like the NSA, we're going to lose the very basic principle of openness that information flows around the world, not just B2B, but B2C. It's all the services that we know and love that the Brazilians are talking about.
You can't trust the Obama administration to head off this trade war, is what you're saying. Oh, hey, you agreed with me for once. Let's take one more question. We're wrapping up. Not even one more question. Two things. If you want to continue the NSA discussion, I'm hosting the LavaBit founder, Ladar Levison, at CNET, 235 2nd Street tonight at 6 o'clock. We can talk NSA then. EFF is also sending a representative. And also, this event was co-sponsored by TechFreedom, the Reason Foundation, and the Charles Koch Institute. So let's give them and our panelists a round of applause.